On April 1st, 1924, Election Day in Cicero, Illinois, a working-class town of 60,000 people immediately west of Chicago, citizens attempting to vote found themselves facing something unprecedented in American democracy, an occupying army of gangsters who'd taken over their town. Over 200 armed men, loyal to Al Capone, stood at polling places throughout Cicero, intimidating voters, stuffing ballot boxes, beating anyone who tried to resist, turning democratic election into violent farce, where the only votes that mattered were the ones Capone's men manufactured. By mid-afternoon, the violence had escalated to the point where Chicago police, 70 squad cars full of officers, crossed into Cicero to restore order, resulting in gun battles on the streets where Capone's men and police exchanged hundreds of rounds of ammunition. When the smoke cleared, Al Capone's brother, Frank Capone, was dead, shot by police detectives in an alley, but Al Capone had won what he'd come to Cicero to win: complete control of a town that would become his headquarters for the next 8 years, a place where every police officer was on his payroll, where every elected official answered to him rather than to voters, where law enforcement had been so thoroughly corrupted that Capone could operate breweries and speakeasies and gambling dens and brothels openly without fear of arrest, and where the local government functioned not as representative democracy, but as criminal enterprise designed to facilitate bootlegging operations that would make Al Capone the most powerful and wealthy gangster in American history. What happened in Cicero between 1924 and 1931 wasn't just corruption in the usual sense. It was the complete purchase of an American town, the transformation of municipal government into subsidiary of criminal organization, and the demonstration that when enough money was combined with enough violence, democratic institutions could be destroyed and replaced with systems where criminals wielded power that was supposed to belong to citizens. If you have the courage to hear this story, click here to find out what happened. But I warn you, the details reveal how fragile democratic governance can be when confronted with organized criminal violence backed by enormous wealth. This narrative explores how Al Capone methodically corrupted every level of government in Cicero, Illinois, how he bribed police officers and politicians and judges until opposition became impossible, how he used the town as headquarters for bootlegging empire that generated over $100 million annually, and how Prohibition-era America created conditions where towns could be purchased outright by gangsters, where law enforcement could be neutralized through systematic corruption, and where citizens discovered that voting and civic participation were meaningless when criminal organizations had more money and more guns than the institutions that were supposed to protect democracy. The morning of April 1st, 1924, began normally in Cicero, Illinois. Residents went to their polling places to vote in local elections that would determine the town's leadership for the next 4 years. Mayor, town council members, judges, police officials, all the positions that govern daily life in a working-class suburb where most residents worked in factories, raised families in modest homes, and tried to live ordinary American lives. But by 9 a.m., as polls opened, it became clear this wouldn't be ordinary election. Groups of men, clearly not local residents, speaking with accents that marked them as Chicago gangsters, wearing expensive suits that made them stand out among Cicero's working-class voters, began appearing at polling places throughout the town. They positioned themselves near entrances to voting locations, watched as residents approached, made their presence intimidating through their numbers and through the obvious bulges under their jackets that indicated they were armed. At Hawthorne Elementary School, serving as polling place for Ward 2, Democratic election judge William Flom attempted to challenge several suspicious-looking voters who appeared to be voting multiple times using different names. He was beaten by 5 men who dragged him into an alley, broke his jaw, fractured several ribs, and left him unconscious in the dirt. When Flom's brother George, also serving as election judge, tried to intervene, he was beaten as well and threatened that if he continued interfering with voting, his entire family would be killed. At Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church polling station in Ward 4, Democratic election watcher John Varchetto observed men who weren't registered voters casting ballots, attempted to report this to police, and was kidnapped by 6 men who forced him into a car, drove him to an abandoned factory, beat him severely, and held him captive until after polls closed, ensuring he couldn't report the fraud he'd witnessed. Throughout Cicero, similar scenes unfolded. Legitimate voters were intimidated away from polls. Opposition party election workers were beaten or kidnapped. Ballot boxes were stuffed with fraudulent votes, and anyone attempting to resist was threatened with violence or was actually assaulted to demonstrate that resistance would result in injury or death. By noon, word of the violence had reached Chicago newspapers. Reporters rushed to Cicero, began documenting the chaos, began interviewing victims who described being beaten by gangsters, described watching armed men openly intimidating voters and stealing ballot boxes. The Chicago Tribune would run front-page story the next day describing Election Day warfare and gangster army invades Cicero. But the real confrontation came around 2 p.m. when Chicago police, responding to emergency calls from Cicero officials who'd lost control of their own town, sent 70 squad cars, over 200 police officers, many of them plainclothes detectives carrying shotguns and Thompson submachine guns, across the Chicago city limits into Cicero to restore order. The arrival of armed Chicago police escalated the situation from intimidation to warfare. Al Capone's men, who'd been beating voters and stuffing ballot boxes, suddenly found themselves confronted by overwhelming police force. Some fled immediately, abandoning their positions at polling places and running for vehicles, but others, either more loyal or more foolish, attempted to resist. At the corner of Cicero Avenue and 22nd Street, Frank Capone, Al Capone's older brother, who'd been coordinating the election takeover, was confronted by 2 Chicago police detectives, Philip McGlynn and Edward Dougherty. According to police accounts, Frank Capone drew a revolver, attempted to shoot the detectives, and was gunned down in the resulting exchange, hit by multiple bullets from police weapons, dying on the sidewalk within minutes. Frank Capone was 28 years old, had been working for his brother for less than 2 years, and his death marked the only significant consequence that Al Capone would face for the violent takeover of Cicero's elections. Al Capone himself was present in Cicero during the violence, was observed by multiple witnesses directing his men, was personally involved in intimidating voters and coordinating the ballot box stuffing. When news reached him that his brother Frank had been killed by police, Al reportedly wept, then became coldly calm, ordered his men to withdraw from polling places rather than risk further confrontation with Chicago police, and calculated that he'd already accomplished what he'd come to Cicero to achieve. Enough fraudulent votes had been cast, enough legitimate voters had been intimidated away from polls, that the candidates he supported would win regardless of what happened in the remaining hours of voting. By the time polls closed at 6 p.m., Al Capone's slate of candidates had won every contested race. Joseph Clenha was elected mayor, defeating reform candidate who'd campaigned on promises to drive organized crime out of Cicero. Capone-friendly candidates won town council seats, won judgeships, won police department positions. The democratic will of Cicero's citizens had been nullified through violence and fraud, and Al Capone had purchased a town that would serve as his headquarters for the next 8 years. The aftermath of the April 1st election violence shocked the Chicago region and made national news. Over 100 people had been beaten or intimidated. Frank Capone and one Capone associate were dead. Property damage ran into thousands of dollars, and the fundamental legitimacy of democratic governance in an American town had been destroyed. But no one was prosecuted for election fraud or violence. No Capone associates were arrested despite dozens of witnesses who could identify them. The newly elected Cicero government, controlled by Capone, showed no interest in investigating crimes committed to install them in office. Chicago police, who'd killed Frank Capone, were investigated and cleared of wrongdoing. The shooting was ruled justified self-defense against an armed criminal. Al Capone attended his brother's funeral a week later, a lavish affair with 20,000 mourners, with flower arrangements costing tens of thousands of dollars, with a spectacle that demonstrated Capone's wealth and power. And then he got back to work, consolidating his control over Cicero, bribing officials he'd just helped elect, transforming a town of 60,000 people into the headquarters for a criminal empire that would make him the most famous gangster in American history. The stakes in the Cicero story extend far beyond one town's corruption or one gangster's criminal activities. At issue was whether American democracy could survive when confronted with organized criminal violence backed by enormous wealth generated by prohibition, whether institutions designed to protect citizens and enforce laws could function when those institutions were systematically corrupted, and whether citizens could exercise democratic rights when criminal organizations had more power than the government that was supposed to protect them. Cicero's corruption destroyed social trust. The fundamental belief that laws would be enforced fairly, that elections would reflect voters' will, that government officials would serve public interest rather than criminal interests. When police officers were taking bribes from Al Capone, when elected officials were following Capone's orders rather than serving constituents, when judges were dismissing charges against Capone's men while prosecuting anyone who opposed him, citizens learned that the institutions that were supposed to protect them were actually working for criminals. This destruction of social trust had cascading effects. Citizens stopped reporting crimes because they knew police were corrupt, knew that reporting crimes committed by Capone's organization might result in retaliation rather than justice. Legitimate businesses struggled because they couldn't compete with Capone-connected businesses that had protection from law enforcement, that could operate illegal enterprises openly, that could use violence against competitors without fear of prosecution. Civic participation collapsed because citizens learned that voting was meaningless when elections were controlled by criminal organization, that running for office was dangerous if you opposed Capone, that participating in government meant either working for Capone or being destroyed by him. The result was civic death, a town where government existed but didn't function as democracy, where institutions remained but had been hollowed out and converted into tools for criminal enterprise rather than for public service. Cicero, under Capone's control, became extraordinarily dangerous for anyone who wasn't connected to his organization or who wasn't willing to pay for protection. Violence was routine. Beatings, shootings, bombings occurred regularly as Capone's organization eliminated competitors, punished people who couldn't pay gambling debts or extortion payments, and demonstrated to anyone considering resistance that opposition would result in injury or death. Police protection was unavailable for ordinary citizens because police worked for Capone, responded to his priorities rather than to public safety concerns, and would arrest victims of Capone's violence for disturbing the peace while ignoring the violence that had victimized them. Property wasn't secure because Capone's organization could seize buildings for use as speakeasies or gambling dens or brothels, could demand protection payments from business owners under threat of arson or vandalism, and could destroy any property they chose without facing legal consequences. Citizens who'd moved to Cicero for a safe suburban environment discovered they were living in occupied territory where criminal organization exercised power that legitimate government couldn't or wouldn't challenge. The corruption cost Cicero's residents and legitimate businesses enormous amounts of money. Protection payments were required from most businesses. Bar owners, restaurant owners, shop owners all paid regular tribute to Capone's organization to avoid being burned out or beaten, to ensure police would respond if they were robbed by criminals who weren't affiliated with Capone, to maintain minimal security that government should have provided but didn't. Inflated prices resulted from Capone's monopolistic control over certain industries. Beer and liquor sold in Cicero was more expensive than it would have been in competitive market because Capone controlled distribution and could set prices without fear of competition. Property values declined as Cicero's reputation as crime-ridden suburb made it less desirable place to live or operate businesses, as families with resources moved away rather than raise children in environment dominated by organized crime. Tax revenue was diverted through corruption. Money that should have funded schools and infrastructure and public services instead went into pockets of officials who'd been bribed by Capone or was never collected from Capone-connected businesses that operated without proper licenses or tax payments. The financial cost to Cicero's 60,000 residents over the 8 years of Capone's control was tens of millions of dollars, money extracted through extortion, through inflated prices, through corruption that diverted public resources to private criminal purposes. Cicero demonstrated how completely institutions could be corrupted when criminal organizations had sufficient resources and willingness to use violence. The police department was converted from law enforcement agency into private security force for Al Capone, where officers took orders from gangsters rather than from legitimate commanders, where arrest powers were used to harass Capone's enemies rather than to prosecute criminals. The court system became farce, where Capone-friendly judges dismissed charges against Capone associates while convicting anyone who opposed him on trumped-up charges, where justice was for sale to the highest bidder, where legal proceedings served criminal interests rather than rule of law. The electoral system was destroyed. Elections after 1924 were controlled through violence and fraud. Opposition candidates were intimidated into withdrawing or were beaten if they persisted, and voting became meaningless exercise where outcomes were predetermined by Capone's organization rather than by citizens' choices. The municipal government functioned as subsidiary of criminal enterprise, where town resources were directed toward facilitating Capone's operations, where official decisions were made based on how they'd affect Capone's profits rather than on how they'd serve public interest. This institutional corruption demonstrated that American democratic institutions, for all their constitutional protections and civic mythology, could be destroyed when confronted with sufficient criminal violence and wealth, that the rule of law was fragile when criminals controlled the people who were supposed to enforce laws, and that citizens' rights meant nothing when the institutions protecting those rights had been purchased by criminal organizations. To understand how Al Capone came to control Cicero, one must understand the broader context: prohibition, the opportunities it created for organized crime, the specific situation in Chicago, and the circumstances that made Cicero attractive as headquarters for bootlegging operations. On January 16, 1920, The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors throughout the United States. The Volstead Act, passed to enforce the amendment, defined intoxicating liquors as anything containing more than 0.5% alcohol, effectively banning beer, wine, and spirits that Americans had consumed legally for the nation's entire history. Prohibition was the culmination of decades of temperance activism, was supported by progressive reformers who believed alcohol caused poverty and crime, by Protestant religious groups who viewed drinking as sinful, and by women's groups who'd seen how male alcoholism destroyed families. The goal was to improve American society by eliminating the social problems that temperance advocates attributed to alcohol consumption. But Prohibition's actual effects were catastrophic for rule of law and democratic governance. Demand for alcohol didn't disappear. Millions of Americans who'd drunk legally before Prohibition continued wanting alcohol after it was prohibited, creating enormous market for illegal liquor. Criminal organizations seized the opportunity. Gangsters who'd operated small-scale illegal enterprises, gambling, prostitution, theft, suddenly had access to enormously profitable market in illegal alcohol, market that generated more revenue than all their previous criminal activities combined. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. Police and federal prohibition agents couldn't possibly enforce laws that millions of Americans violated routinely, couldn't stop bootlegging operations that had popular support and that generated enough money to bribe officials who were supposed to stop them. Corruption became systematic. The enormous profits from bootlegging meant criminal organizations could afford to bribe police, judges, politicians at every level of government, could purchase protection that made them essentially immune to prosecution. By the mid-1920s, Prohibition had created conditions where criminal organizations like Al Capone's had more money and more power than the government institutions that were supposed to suppress them, where law enforcement had been so thoroughly corrupted that arresting major bootleggers was nearly impossible, and where democratic governance was subordinated to criminal interests because criminals could simply buy whatever cooperation they needed from officials who were supposed to serve the public. Chicago in the 1920s was second largest city in America, with population over 2.7 million, was industrial and commercial hub with enormous working-class population that wanted to drink despite Prohibition, and was geographically positioned to serve as distribution center for illegal alcohol being smuggled from Canada or produced in local breweries. The city's bootlegging industry was enormous. Thousands of speakeasies, illegal bars, operated openly throughout Chicago. Estimates ranged from 7,000 to 10,000 establishments serving alcohol in violation of prohibition laws. Dozens of breweries continued operating illegally, producing near beer, 0.5% alcohol, legally but actually producing full-strength beer that was distributed through criminal networks. Massive smuggling operations brought Canadian whiskey across Great Lakes and through Detroit, brought Caribbean rum through East Coast ports, brought alcohol from every possible source to meet Chicago's insatiable demand. The revenue was staggering. Chicago's bootlegging industry generated an estimated $50 to $100 million annually by mid-1920s, more than the budget of many state governments, enough money to corrupt any official who could be corrupted and to eliminate any official who couldn't. Chicago's bootlegging was controlled by various criminal organizations, primarily Italian gangs and Irish gangs that divided city into territories and that enforced their territorial claims through violence. The Italian gangs were led initially by Johnny Torrio, an organized crime pioneer who'd brought young Al Capone to Chicago from New York in 1919 to work as enforcer, and who'd taught Capone how to operate criminal enterprises on industrial scale. By 1924, tensions between rival bootlegging gangs were escalating toward open warfare. Multiple murders were occurring as gangs fought over territory, and law enforcement was either unable or unwilling to stop the violence because police and politicians had been corrupted by the same gangs they were supposed to be prosecuting. Why Cicero? Cicero, Illinois, was an independent municipality immediately west of Chicago, sharing a border with the city but operating under its own government with its own police force and its own elected officials. The town had population of approximately 60,000 in 1924, was primarily working class with large populations of Czech, Italian, and Polish immigrants who worked in the manufacturing plants and warehouses that employed most of Cicero's residents. Several factors made Cicero attractive to Al Capone as headquarters for his bootlegging operations. Proximity to Chicago. Cicero was literally adjacent to Chicago, separated only by city limits, meaning alcohol produced in Cicero could be easily transported into Chicago, where most customers were located. Independent government. Cicero's independence from Chicago meant Chicago police had no jurisdiction there, meant that controlling Cicero's local government would provide protection from Chicago law enforcement that was beginning to pressure Capone's operations within city limits. Smaller scale. Cicero's government was much smaller than Chicago's, with fewer officials who needed to be bribed, with less sophisticated law enforcement that would be easier to corrupt or intimidate, with a political system that could be controlled completely with less effort than would be required to control Chicago's massive municipal government. Industrial character. Cicero had numerous industrial buildings that could be converted into breweries or distilleries, had truck traffic that was normal part of the town's economy, and that could conceal shipments of illegal alcohol, had working-class population that was generally sympathetic to bootlegging, or at least wasn't strongly opposed. Existing corruption. Cicero's government was already somewhat corrupt before Capone arrived, with gambling operations and low-level vice that local police tolerated in exchange for bribes, meaning that the institutional resistance to further corruption would be limited. Al Capone didn't invent the idea of using suburbs as bootlegging headquarters. Other gangsters had recognized that operating in municipalities adjacent to but independent from Chicago provided advantages, but Capone would perfect the strategy, would corrupt Cicero so completely that the town would essentially become subsidiary of his criminal organization, would demonstrate that an entire American town could be purchased and controlled by single criminal enterprise if that enterprise had sufficient money and sufficient willingness to use violence. To understand how Al Capone came to control Cicero, one must understand who Capone was, his background, his rise through organized crime, and the skills and ruthlessness that made him capable of corrupting an entire town. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents who'd come to America in the 1890s seeking economic opportunity that wasn't available in impoverished southern Italy. Al was the fourth of 9 children, grew up in rough Brooklyn neighborhood where Italian immigrants lived in tenements and where opportunities for legitimate advancement were limited. Young Al attended school through 6th grade before dropping out at age 14 after hitting a female teacher who'd struck him, an incident that reflected Capone's violent temper and his refusal to accept authority that he viewed as illegitimate or disrespectful. After leaving school, Capone worked various jobs, in a candy store, in a bowling alley, as a cutter in a book bindery, but was drawn increasingly to street gangs where quick money and respect were available to young men willing to fight and willing to commit crimes. By his mid-teens, Capone had joined the 5 Points Gang, one of Brooklyn's most powerful criminal organizations, led by Frankie Yale, who would become Capone's mentor in organized crime. Through the 5 Points Gang, Capone learned skills that would serve him throughout his criminal career: how to organize criminal operations, how to use violence strategically rather than emotionally, how to bribe officials to avoid prosecution, how to maintain loyalty among subordinates through combination of generosity and fear. In his late teens, Capone worked as bartender and bouncer at Yale's Harvard Inn, a Coney Island bar and brothel. It was during this period that Capone received the facial scars that would earn him the nickname Scarface. Scars from knife fight with another gangster that left 3 permanent marks on Capone's left cheek. Capone hated the nickname, preferred to be called Snorky, slang for well-dressed, and would later tell journalists that his facial scars came from combat service in World War I rather than admitting they came from bar fight. In 1919, at age 20, Al Capone moved to Chicago at the invitation of Johnny Torrio, who'd worked with Capone in New York and who'd moved to Chicago to work for his uncle, Jim Colosimo, who ran extensive prostitution and gambling operations in Chicago's First Ward. Torrio brought Capone to Chicago to work as enforcer, to handle the violent work that Torrio's operations required, collecting debts, intimidating competitors, eliminating people who threatened the organization. Capone's move to Chicago was perfectly timed. Prohibition began in January 1920, just months after Capone arrived, creating enormous opportunities for criminals who could organize and control bootlegging operations. Torrio recognized immediately that bootlegging would be far more profitable than the prostitution and gambling operations that had been organized crime's primary revenue sources, and he moved aggressively to establish control over Chicago's illegal alcohol trade. But Jim Colosimo, Torrio's uncle and the boss of the organization, was less enthusiastic about bootlegging. He was making good money from existing operations, was older and more conservative, didn't want to risk the law enforcement attention that large-scale bootlegging would attract. In May 1920, Colosimo was murdered in his own restaurant, shot from behind by unknown assassin. The murder was never solved, though it was widely believed that Torrio had ordered the hit and that Capone might have been the shooter or had arranged for New York gangsters to carry out the killing. With Colosimo dead, Torrio took control of the organization and immediately moved to dominate Chicago bootlegging. He organized territories, negotiated with other gangs to avoid conflicts, established breweries and distribution networks, and brought business efficiency to criminal enterprise. And he promoted Al Capone to be his right-hand man, his enforcer, the person who'd handle the violent work that bootlegging required. Through the early 1920s, Al Capone learned how to operate criminal enterprise on industrial scale. He managed breweries that produced thousands of barrels of illegal beer weekly, learned about production costs and distribution logistics, and how to maximize profits from illegal operation. He organized distribution networks that delivered alcohol to speakeasies throughout Chicago, learned how to use legitimate trucking companies and corrupt law enforcement to move illegal products without being intercepted. He negotiated territorial agreements with other gangs, learned when to compromise and when to fight, learned that avoiding unnecessary conflict was more profitable than wars that killed people and disrupted operations. He enforced discipline within the organization, learned that loyalty could be purchased through generosity, but needed to be maintained through willingness to use violence against people who stole or who betrayed the organization. He corrupted officials at every level, learned that everyone had a price, that police and judges and politicians could be bought if you offered enough money and were willing to use violence against those who refused bribes. By 1924, Capone was one of the most powerful figures in Chicago organized crime, was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars annually from bootlegging operations, and was known throughout the city as someone who combined business acumen with ruthless violence, who could negotiate sophisticated agreements with rival gangs while personally murdering people who threatened him or who showed insufficient respect. But Capone's operations in Chicago were becoming constrained. Chicago police, under pressure from reform groups and federal prohibition agents, were occasionally raiding speakeasies and breweries. Rival gangs were fighting over territory, and the sheer size of Chicago made it difficult to control bootlegging completely. What Capone needed was a secure base of operations where he could produce alcohol without interference, where police and government were completely under his control, where he could operate openly without fearing raids or prosecution. That's why Capone looked to Cicero. Al Capone's conquest of Cicero occurred in stages between 1923 and 1924, progressing from establishing operations in the town to systematically corrupting local government to the violent election takeover that gave him complete control. Stage 1. Establishing presence, 1923. Capone's initial move into Cicero was opportunistic. Johnny Torrio, still nominally Capone's boss, though increasingly handing operational control to his younger protege, identified Cicero as potential location for brewery operations that would be safer than operating in Chicago, where police raids were becoming more frequent. In late 1923, Capone began leasing buildings in Cicero's industrial areas, ostensibly for legitimate businesses, but actually to establish breweries and distilleries. The initial operations were small, 1 or 2 buildings producing relatively modest quantities of beer and liquor that would be transported into Chicago for distribution. But even these initial operations required corrupting local law enforcement. Capone approached Cicero police officers, offered bribes, and discovered that the police department was receptive. Officers were underpaid, the department was poorly managed, and there was no strong institutional culture of integrity that would have made officers resistant to corruption. The bribes started small, $20 or $50 per week for individual officers to look the other way when Capone's trucks moved through town, to not investigate suspicious activities at buildings that were supposed to be legitimate businesses. But as Capone's operations expanded, the bribes increased. By early 1924, some Cicero police officers were earning more from Capone's bribes than from their official salaries, were functionally working for Capone rather than for the town government that officially employed them. Stage 2. Political corruption, early 1924. As Capone's operations in Cicero expanded, he realized that bribing individual police officers wasn't sufficient. He needed control over the entire town government to ensure that his operations could continue without interference, that no reform movements could threaten his breweries and speakeasies, that Cicero would function as his personal territory where he had more power than any legitimate authority. Capone began meeting with Cicero's existing political leadership, Democratic Party officials who controlled most town offices, Republican opposition leaders who might be potential allies or enemies depending on their price. He offered campaign contributions, offered personal bribes, and assessed who could be bought and who would need to be intimidated or eliminated. Most of Cicero's political leadership was corruptible. They weren't ideologically committed to good government, weren't particularly honest or principled, were local politicians who'd gotten into politics for personal advantage rather than from commitment to public service. When Capone offered money, they accepted. When Capone suggested policies that would benefit his operations, they implemented those policies. When Capone wanted specific people appointed to positions in police department or in town administration, those appointments were made. But some Cicero politicians resisted, reform-minded individuals who understood that allowing Capone to control the town would destroy democratic governance, who refused bribes, who began organizing opposition to Capone's influence. These individuals became targets for intimidation. They received threats. Their businesses were vandalized. Some were beaten by Capone's enforcers to demonstrate that opposition would be punished. By March 1924, Capone had secured support from enough Cicero officials that he could operate relatively freely, but he didn't have complete control. There were still officials who opposed him, still police officers who weren't on his payroll, still the possibility that future elections might install reform government that would drive him out of Cicero. That's when Capone decided the April 1924 elections needed to be controlled absolutely, needed to install completely loyal government that would give him permanent secure base in Cicero. Stage 3. The April 1924 election violence. The April 1st election violence has already been described. Over 200 armed Capone associates invading Cicero, beating and kidnapping opposition election workers, stuffing ballot boxes, turning democratic election into farce. But understanding the planning that preceded the violence reveals how systematically Capone approached the corruption of an entire town. Weeks before the election, Capone held meetings with his top associates, his brothers Ralph and Frank Capone, his enforcers Jack Machine Gun McGurn and Frank Nitti, his business managers who handled the financial aspects of his operations. He assigned specific responsibilities. Frank Capone would coordinate activities on Election Day, would organize the men who'd intimidate voters and stuff ballot boxes. Ralph Capone would handle logistics, transportation, weapons, bail money for anyone arrested. McGurn would lead the enforcement teams, would ensure that anyone attempting to interfere with Capone's election plans would be beaten or killed. Capone also met with the candidates he was supporting, made clear that he expected loyalty after they were elected, established that they'd be working for him rather than for Cicero's citizens, negotiated the terms of his control over town government before those candidates were even in office. The Election Day violence succeeded in its objectives. Capone's candidates won every contested race. Opposition was crushed, and Cicero's government after April 1st, 1924, belonged to Al Capone as completely as if he'd held every office himself. Stage 4. Systematic corruption, 1924 to 1925. With friendly government installed, Capone moved to corrupt Cicero's institutions systematically and completely. The police department was transformed from law enforcement agency into security force for Capone's operations. The police chief position was filled with Capone loyalists who took orders directly from Capone rather than from mayor or town council. Individual officers were given choice: accept Capone's bribes and work for him, or be fired and potentially beaten. New hiring favored individuals who'd worked for Capone or who were recommended by his organization. Police resources were directed toward protecting Capone's breweries and speakeasies rather than toward general law enforcement. Officers who attempted to maintain integrity or who tried to investigate Capone's operations were transferred, fired, or in some cases beaten and driven out of town. By 1925, Cicero's police department had approximately 50 officers, nearly all of whom were on Capone's payroll, who took bribes ranging from $50 to $500 per month, depending on their rank and their usefulness to Capone's operations. The court system was corrupted through bribing judges and through controlling prosecutions. Cicero's municipal judge, who handled misdemeanor cases and preliminary hearings for felonies, was paid monthly retainer by Capone to dismiss charges against Capone associates. The town prosecutor's office declined to file charges against Capone-connected individuals or filed charges that were deliberately weak and easily dismissed. When cases did proceed to trial, witnesses were intimidated or bribed to change their testimony or to fail to appear in court. The town government was converted into administrative apparatus for facilitating Capone's operations. Building inspectors issued permits for Capone's breweries and speakeasies while denying permits to competitors or to businesses that refused to pay Capone protection money. The health department didn't inspect Capone's establishments for violations. The fire department didn't investigate suspicious fires at businesses that competed with Capone or that owed him money. Town contracts for supplies and services went to Capone-connected businesses regardless of whether they submitted competitive bids. The result was complete corruption. Every aspect of Cicero's government had been purchased and was operating to serve Capone's interests rather than citizens' interests. Democratic accountability had been eliminated, and the rule of law had been replaced by rule of criminal organization that had more power than any legitimate institution in the town. Once Al Capone controlled Cicero completely, he used the town as headquarters for bootlegging empire that would generate over $100 million annually at its peak, and that would make him the wealthiest and most powerful gangster in American history. Capone established multiple breweries in Cicero, producing beer that would be distributed to speakeasies throughout Chicago and surrounding areas. The Hawthorne Brewery was Capone's largest operation, located in former industrial building on 22nd Street. The brewery produced an estimated 50,000 barrels of beer annually, operating 24 hours a day with 3 shifts of workers. The building was fortified, steel doors, barred windows, guards with machine guns at entrances, because even though Cicero police wouldn't raid it, there was always danger from rival gangs attempting to destroy Capone's operations or from federal prohibition agents who weren't on Capone's payroll. The Anton Brewery was a smaller operation producing approximately 20,000 barrels annually, focused on higher quality beer that would be sold to upscale speakeasies where customers were willing to pay premium prices. Several smaller operations produced both beer and distilled liquor, operating in warehouses and industrial buildings scattered throughout Cicero, deliberately dispersed so that raids on any single location wouldn't shut down all production. The breweries employed hundreds of workers, brewers who understood the technical aspects of beer production, laborers who moved ingredients and finished products, truck drivers who transported beer to distribution points, guards who protected facilities against raids or against theft by employees. Most workers were paid well by 1920s standards, $50 to $100 per week, when typical factory workers earned $20 to $30 per week. But they understood that the generous wages came with expectation of absolute loyalty and absolute silence about what they saw. Cicero, under Capone's control, had approximately 150 to 200 establishments that sold illegal alcohol, ranging from working-class bars where factory workers drank beer after shifts to upscale nightclubs that featured entertainment and served expensive cocktails to wealthy customers from Chicago who'd drive to Cicero for night out. The Hawthorne Inn at 483 322nd Street was Capone's personal headquarters, a hotel and restaurant that served as his office, where he conducted business, where he met with associates and with the politicians and police officials who were on his payroll. The Hawthorne Inn was fortified like military facility, armed guards at entrances, armored doors, escape routes in case of raids or attacks by rival gangs. Capone lived in suite on the building's upper floors, worked from office on the ground floor, and held court like a monarch rather than like a criminal operating illegally. The Ship Cafe was one of Cicero's largest and most popular speakeasies, featuring live music, dancing, and a bar that served hundreds of customers nightly. Drinks ranged from 50 cents for beer to $2 to $3 for cocktails, expensive by 1920s standards when legal beer before Prohibition had cost 5 to 10 cents per glass. The Ship generated an estimated $5,000 to $10,000 per night in revenue, most of which went to Capone's organization after paying expenses and bribes. The Cotton Club, the Subway, the Greyhound Inn, dozens of establishments throughout Cicero selling Capone's beer and liquor, providing gambling opportunities, craps, cards, slot machines, and in many cases providing prostitution. Each establishment paid Capone both for the alcohol they purchased from his breweries and as protection money that guaranteed police wouldn't raid them and that Capone's organization would protect them from robbery or from competition. The gambling operations were particularly profitable. Cicero's gambling dens generated an estimated $25 to $50 million annually from bets on horse races, from casino games, from slot machines installed in bars and restaurants throughout the town. The gambling was completely illegal, operated openly with police protection, and generated revenue that exceeded what Capone earned from bootlegging. Beer and liquor produced in Cicero needed to be distributed to speakeasies throughout Chicago and surrounding areas. Capone organized a distribution network that combined legitimate businesses, trucking companies that also transported legal goods, with corrupt law enforcement that allowed illegal shipments to move without interference. The distribution system worked as follows. Production: breweries in Cicero produced beer and liquor that was stored in warehouses awaiting distribution. Orders: speakeasy owners throughout Chicago would place orders with Capone's organization, specifying quantities and delivery schedules. Loading: beer and liquor would be loaded onto trucks, often concealed among legitimate cargo or transported in trucks painted to look like delivery vehicles for legitimate businesses. Transport: trucks would be driven to Chicago following routes that had been cleared with corrupt police who'd been bribed to not stop Capone's vehicles or to not inspect them if they were stopped for other reasons. Delivery: beer and liquor would be delivered to speakeasies, usually in early morning hours when street traffic was minimal and when police presence was lowest. Payment: speakeasy owners would pay cash, which would be transported back to Cicero and divided among Capone's organization, some going to Capone and his top associates, some going to pay production costs and transportation expenses, some going to bribe police and officials. The distribution network employed hundreds of people: truck drivers, warehouse workers, accountants who tracked inventory and payments, enforcers who ensured speakeasy owners paid on time, and who dealt with people who tried to cheat the organization. In addition to revenue from bootlegging and gambling, Capone extracted money from Cicero businesses through protection racket. Businesses paid regular tribute to Capone's organization to avoid vandalism, arson, or violence against owners and employees. The protection payments were structured based on business size and profitability. Small retail businesses, grocery stores, bakeries, barbershops, paid $10 to $25 per month, not enough to bankrupt them, but enough to be significant expense that reduced their profits. Larger businesses, restaurants, theaters, larger retail establishments, paid $50 to $200 per month, with amounts negotiated based on the business's revenue and the owner's ability to pay. Industrial facilities, factories, warehouses paid hundreds or thousands per month, with payments sometimes structured as percentages of revenue rather than as fixed amounts. Business owners who refused to pay faced escalating consequences: vandalism, broken windows, defaced storefronts, theft, merchandise stolen by Capone's men who'd break in at night, arson, buildings burned as demonstration that resistance would result in complete destruction, and, in some cases, physical violence against owners or employees. The protection racket generated an estimated $5 to $10 million annually for Capone's organization, was particularly insidious because it taxed legitimate businesses to support criminal enterprise, turned normal business operation into ongoing relationship with organized crime that business owners couldn't escape. The total revenue generated by Capone's operations in Cicero and throughout his Chicago territory was staggering. Bootlegging, $60 to $70 million annually from beer and liquor sales. Gambling, $25 to $50 million annually from various gambling operations. Prostitution, $10 to $15 million annually from brothels and prostitution networks. Protection rackets, $5 to $10 million annually from businesses forced to pay tribute. Other operations, $5 to $10 million from various other criminal activities. Total annual revenue, $105 to $155 million, making Capone one of the wealthiest individuals in America in the 1920s, richer than most legitimate businessmen, commanding resources that exceeded the budgets of many state governments. Of this revenue, Capone personally kept an estimated $25 to $30 million annually after paying expenses and sharing profits with associates. In an era when typical American workers earned $1,000 to $1,500 per year, when millionaires were rare, Capone's wealth was extraordinary, and much of this wealth was generated in Cicero, the town he'd purchased through violence and systematic corruption, the town where he could operate openly because he'd destroyed democratic governance and had converted municipal government into subsidiary of his criminal enterprise. Al Capone's control of Cicero between 1924 and 1931 required constant maintenance. Bribes had to be paid regularly, loyalty had to be enforced, opposition had to be suppressed, and the corrupt system had to be defended against occasional threats from federal authorities or from reform movements that periodically attempted to restore legitimate governance. Capone maintained detailed bribe schedule that ensured all significant officials in Cicero were on his payroll. Police officers, $50 to $100 per month for patrol officers, $200 to $500 per month for sergeants and higher ranks, with additional payments for specific services, like providing intelligence about federal investigations or for actively protecting Capone's facilities. The police chief, $2,000 to $5,000 per month, enormous sum when his official salary was perhaps $300 per month, plus bonuses for handling specific problems or for successfully suppressing any anti-Capone activity within the department. The mayor and town council members, $500 to $2,000 per month per official, with amounts depending on their position and their usefulness to Capone. The mayor, as the most visible official and the person who could order police actions, received the highest payments. Judges, $1,000 to $3,000 per month for dismissing charges against Capone associates, plus per-case fees of $500 to $2,000 for rulings that were particularly valuable to Capone's operations. Building inspectors, health inspectors, other municipal employees, $25 to $200 per month, depending on their ability to facilitate Capone's operations or to obstruct competitors. The total monthly bribe expense for Cicero officials was approximately $30,000 to $50,000, $450,000 to $750,000 annually. a significant cost, but one that was easily absorbed by operations generating $100 million or more annually. The bribes were paid regularly, typically on the first of each month, delivered in cash by Capone's bagmen who would visit each official personally. The personal delivery served multiple purposes. Ensured officials actually received their bribes, preventing theft by intermediaries, reminded officials that they were being paid by Capone and owed him loyalty, and allowed Capone's representatives to assess whether officials were maintaining sufficient loyalty or whether they were becoming problems that needed additional incentive or needed to be replaced. Bribes alone weren't sufficient to maintain control. Capone also needed enforcement mechanisms to deal with people who refused bribes, who tried to oppose him, or who accepted bribes but didn't deliver the cooperation they'd promised. Intimidation was the first level of enforcement. Individuals who opposed Capone would receive visits from his enforcers, would be threatened with violence, would be shown that resistance would bring personal consequences. The threats were often sufficient. Most people, when confronted with credible threat of violence backed by organization known to routinely murder people, would abandon opposition rather than risk injury or death. Economic pressure was used against businesses that wouldn't cooperate. Capone could order his organization to boycott businesses, could pressure other businesses to stop working with holdouts, could use his control over town government to create regulatory problems, denied permits, failed inspections, revoked licenses that would make it impossible for businesses to operate. Violence was reserved for people who continued resisting after intimidation, and economic pressure had failed, or for people whose resistance was so visible that allowing it to continue would encourage others. Beatings administered by Capone's enforcers, arson against properties owned by resistors, and in extreme cases, murder of individuals who were leading opposition to Capone's control. The violence was strategic rather than random. Capone didn't want to create chaos, wanted to demonstrate that resistance would be punished while cooperation would be rewarded. The goal was to make opposing Capone seem futile and dangerous, to make accepting bribes and following his instructions seem like the only rational choice, to create a situation where resistance was so costly that almost nobody would attempt it. Capone maintained extensive intelligence network in Cicero that allowed him to identify problems before they became serious threats. Police informants reported on any federal investigations, on any reform movements within the department, on any officers who weren't accepting bribes or who were considering cooperating with federal authorities. Political informants reported on discussions within town government, on any officials who were wavering in their loyalty to Capone, on any attempts by reform candidates to organize for future elections. Business community informants reported on business owners who were considering refusing protection payments, on anyone organizing boycotts of Capone-connected businesses, on any attempts to form business associations that might resist Capone collectively. General population informants included bartenders, shop owners, neighbors who'd report on anyone speaking openly against Capone, on anyone contacting federal authorities, on any activity that suggested resistance was being organized. This intelligence network allowed Capone to respond to threats before they materialized, to intervene when officials were considering betraying him, to intimidate resistors before their resistance became organized and public. The network was extensive enough that most Cicero residents understood they were being watched, that any opposition would be reported, that even private conversations might reach Capone's ears if they were overheard by the wrong person. Capone also maintained public image that made his control of Cicero more acceptable to residents who might otherwise have opposed him. Philanthropy. Capone made highly publicized charitable contributions. paid for soup kitchens during economic downturns, provided coal to poor families during winter, made donations to churches and schools. These charitable acts created image of Capone as Robin Hood figure who helped ordinary people even while operating criminal enterprise. Personal accessibility. Unlike many gangsters who hid behind layers of security, Capone was highly visible in Cicero, would walk streets, would chat with residents, would attend public events. This visibility created impression that Capone was part of the community rather than being external oppressor. Economic benefits. Capone's operations employed hundreds of Cicero residents in his breweries, in his speakeasies, in his distribution network, providing wages that were often higher than what workers could earn in legitimate employment. This created economic dependency, where many families benefited from Capone's presence, even while recognizing that his control of the town was fundamentally wrong. Protection of property. Capone's organization actively suppressed street crime in Cicero. Thieves who robbed Cicero residents would be caught and beaten by Capone's enforcers. Vandals would be punished. Order was maintained. This created paradoxical situation where residents felt safer from ordinary crime because of Capone's presence, even while recognizing that Capone himself was the source of organized crime that was far more consequential. The public relations campaign created cognitive dissonance. Residents knew Capone was criminal, knew his control of town was illegitimate, but also saw him as providing benefits and maintaining order. This made organizing effective opposition more difficult because resistance required overcoming not just Capone's bribes and violence, but also the fact that some residents genuinely benefited from his presence, or at least didn't view him as unmitigated evil. Despite Capone's thorough corruption of Cicero's government and his effective suppression of opposition, there were periodic attempts to resist his control, to restore legitimate governance, to end the systematic corruption that had converted the town into headquarters for criminal enterprise. The Swanson Investigation, 1926. In 1926, John A. Swanson, the state's attorney for Cook County, which included Cicero, launched investigation into Capone's operations in Cicero, attempting to build cases that would result in arrests and prosecutions that couldn't be dismissed by Capone-controlled local courts. Swanson's investigators raided several Capone breweries in Cicero, collected evidence of illegal alcohol production, arrested dozens of workers, and attempted to freeze Capone's bank accounts to disrupt his financial operations. The investigation made headlines, created impression that legitimate law enforcement might finally be challenging Capone's control of Cicero. But the investigation ultimately failed. Capone-controlled Cicero police refused to cooperate with Swanson's investigators, declined to provide assistance during raids, and, in some cases, actively obstructed the investigation by alerting Capone's organization about planned raids. Witnesses refused to testify because they feared retaliation from Capone's organization, because they'd been bribed to remain silent, or because they were themselves implicated in criminal activities and didn't want to incriminate themselves. Evidence mysteriously disappeared from evidence lockers, was destroyed in fires at police stations, or was ruled inadmissible by judges who'd been bribed by Capone. The few cases that went to trial resulted in acquittals or in convictions that were overturned on appeal through legal maneuvers that Capone's expensive attorneys executed flawlessly. Within a year, Swanson's investigation had collapsed, having achieved almost nothing beyond temporary disruption of Capone's operations. The failure demonstrated that investigating Capone through local institutions, even county-level institutions that were theoretically independent from Cicero's corrupted government, was futile because Capone's influence extended beyond Cicero into the broader political and law enforcement structures of Cook County. The only investigations that ultimately threatened Capone came from federal authorities who weren't subject to local corruption and who had resources that local law enforcement couldn't match. The Prohibition Bureau began investigating Capone's bootlegging operations in 1927, led by Agent Elliot Ness, who'd assembled a team that became known as the Untouchables because they couldn't be bribed. Ness's team raided Capone breweries, destroyed equipment, arrested workers, and gradually disrupted Capone's bootlegging operations enough to reduce his revenue and to create uncertainty about whether his empire could survive aggressive federal enforcement. The Internal Revenue Service began investigating Capone's income taxes in 1929, recognizing that while proving bootlegging charges was difficult, witnesses wouldn't testify, evidence was easily destroyed, juries were often sympathetic to bootleggers, proving tax evasion was simpler. Capone was obviously living lavishly on income that he wasn't reporting, and tax evasion could be proven through financial records without requiring witnesses who'd need to be protected from retaliation. These federal investigations weren't based in Cicero, didn't rely on Cicero's corrupted police or courts, couldn't be stopped through the local bribes that had protected Capone for years, and eventually they would succeed where local efforts had failed. Some Cicero residents attempted to organize resistance to Capone's control, forming civic groups that demanded restoration of legitimate government, that petitioned state and federal authorities for intervention, that tried to publicize the extent of Cicero's corruption to create pressure for reform. But these citizen resistance efforts faced enormous obstacles. Fear of retaliation meant that most resistance leaders operated semi-anonymously or had to move out of Cicero because they feared violence against themselves or their families. Lack of resources meant citizen groups couldn't match Capone's organization in publicity, in political lobbying, or in any contest that required money. Divided community meant that resistance movements couldn't achieve broad popular support because many Cicero residents benefited from Capone's presence or didn't view his control as intolerable enough to justify the risks of resistance. Futility was perhaps the greatest obstacle. Previous attempts to challenge Capone had failed, created impression that resistance was pointless, that Capone's control was permanent, and that the only rational response was to accept it and try to live as normal a life as possible despite the corruption. The citizen resistance movements achieved some symbolic victories: newspaper coverage of Cicero's corruption, state legislative hearings about municipal corruption, some federal attention to Capone's operations. But they didn't achieve their primary goal of reclaiming Cicero from Capone's control, didn't restore legitimate democratic governance, didn't end the systematic corruption that had persisted since 1924. Al Capone's control of Cicero ended not because of local resistance, but because of federal prosecution that had nothing to do with his corruption of the town. In October 1931, Capone was convicted of federal income tax evasion, was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, and was removed from power over the criminal organization he'd built. The IRS investigation that led to Capone's conviction began in 1929, led by Agent Frank Wilson, who spent 2 years examining Capone's financial records, interviewing witnesses, and building case that Capone had earned millions of dollars that he'd never reported for tax purposes. The key evidence came from ledgers seized during raids on Capone's operations, from testimony by Capone associates who agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity, and from Capone's own lavish lifestyle, his expensive cars, his custom suits, his ownership of properties in Cicero and Miami, that demonstrated he had income far exceeding what he'd reported on the tax returns his lawyers had filed. The trial took place in federal court in Chicago in October 1931. Capone's defense attorneys argued that he couldn't be convicted for failing to pay taxes on illegal income, that forcing him to report bootlegging income would violate his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. But the judge and jury rejected these arguments, convicted Capone on 5 counts of tax evasion, and sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison plus $50,000 in fines, the harshest sentence that had ever been imposed for tax evasion. Capone was sent initially to federal prison in Atlanta, then was transferred in 1934 to Alcatraz, the new maximum security prison in San Francisco Bay that had been created specifically to house dangerous criminals who couldn't be allowed to maintain their criminal operations from inside prison. At Alcatraz, Capone was isolated from his organization, couldn't issue orders, couldn't maintain the network of bribes and violence that had sustained his empire. Without Capone's leadership, his organization fragmented. Other gangsters seized control of his operations, fought among themselves over territory, failed to maintain the discipline and efficiency that Capone had imposed. The Cicero operations continued for several years. The breweries still produced beer, the speakeasies still operated, the corruption of local government persisted, but the organization was weaker, less coordinated, less dominant than it had been under Capone. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing prohibition and making alcohol legal again. This eliminated the foundation of Capone's empire. Bootlegging suddenly wasn't profitable because legal breweries and distilleries could produce alcohol more cheaply and distribute it more efficiently than criminal organizations that had to operate secretly. The end of Prohibition devastated organized crime in Chicago and throughout America. Criminal organizations that had generated enormous wealth from bootlegging suddenly lost their primary revenue source, had to find new criminal enterprises, gambling, labor racketeering, eventually drug trafficking, that weren't as profitable as bootlegging had been. For Cicero specifically, the end of Prohibition eliminated the reason that Capone had corrupted the town in the first place. There was no longer any need for secret breweries, no longer any reason to maintain the expensive bribery system that had protected illegal operations. Capone's organization retained some presence in Cicero, gambling operations continued, some legitimate businesses remained under mob control, but the town was no longer headquarters for criminal empire, was no longer the center of organized crime operations that had made Capone the most powerful gangster in America. Capone was released from federal prison in 1939, having served 7 years, reduced from his 11-year sentence for good behavior. But by then he was physically and mentally destroyed. He'd contracted syphilis years earlier, hadn't received adequate treatment, and the disease had progressed to tertiary stage that caused progressive neurological damage. By 1939, Capone was showing signs of dementia, was no longer capable.